10 years ago, the full set of all of the cards was published by Topps, describing it as, quote, edgy, subversive, and darkly comedic. This over-the-top series depicting a Martian invasion of Earth has a loyal following and continues to win new generations of fans. Much of that is true. Edgy, subversive, and definitely winning over a loyal following with generation after generation. However, darkly comedic and over-the-top is not accurate. While the property has since been reimagined as a dark comedy, especially in light of the Tim Burton film, nevertheless, it is an extremely horrific series. That is not a criticism, but it is a fact. You'll especially see it in this next section here, where the Martians mostly take a back seat while they unleash giant bugs on the Earth. As if the Martian death rays hadn't caused enough destruction and tumult to the people of Earth, a new horror was suddenly released on them. Saucers flew over heavily populated cities, releasing huge insects to destroy property and lives. The Martians had gathered insect specimens from Earth, enlarging them with their scientific equipment to 500 times their regular size. The normally annoying pests were now transformed into deadly menaces, attacking any slow-footed human around. The new peril made Earth citizens more helpless than before, for at any time one of the winged terrors might swoop out of the sky to claim another victim. Without any warning, except for the thunderous flapping of their huge wings, the giant insects would sail down out of the sky. Always hunting new prey, the creatures terrified the people even more than the Martians had. Huge colonies of giant insects sprang up on the outskirts of the city, and the bugs would conduct nightly raids looking for food and human victims. Often the creatures would carry back humans to their camp, where the poor souls would be helpless. The powerful insects were strong enough to carry 200-pound men through the air. Nobody was safe when the bugs were flying in search of food. The emergency shelters that were set up by the government were supplied with enough food to last 100 people at least a month. Well disguised, the shelters were rarely discovered by the Martians as they flew over them in their saucers. However, when the bugs were released, the danger of discovery was greatly increased. The flying creatures would sense the presence of food, and with their appetite increased as greatly as their size, the insects would crash into the shelters. The defenseless people were left at the mercy of the hungry bugs when the beasts managed to enter a shelter. The huge spiders were perhaps the ugliest and most frightening of all the giant insects. The spiders would often spin a web from one side of the street to the other. Automobiles would become hopelessly entangled in the mesh, and their owners would have to abandon them. In the country, a spider would often spin a web from one tree to another, manufacturing a net inescapable to any victim trapped within it. On a dark night, people didn't see the web and they'd stumble into it blindly. If no one arrived to cut the person out of the web, the victim might die of starvation. If the spider were to return, the helpless victim would be at the mercy of the spider's whims. Although the entire city had fled to the countryside to hide, a soldier remained to help a lady scientist gather valuable information about the Martians. The couple were so intent on their work that they failed to notice a long tentacle reach into the room until it had grabbed the woman. Crying out hysterically, the woman was pulled toward the window by the giant creature. The soldier charged the bug with his bayonet and jabbed through the thick skin again and again. Badly hurt, the insect released the woman and she slumped unconsciously to the floor. Even after their hair-raising escapade, the brave duo remained to finish their work. The sound of metal vibrating through the city streets became an announcement of impending disaster during the Martian invasion. Giant robots stalked the streets, destroying everything in its path. Moving slowly, with a Martian working the controls, the steel monster reached down and plucked terrified people off the sidewalks. Its huge pincers held any captive in a death-like grip until the Martian decided to apply the final squeeze. Powerful melting beams seared the buildings and left only rubble in their place. The robot, capable of crashing through brick walls, was made of an alloy unknown on Earth. Military weapons had no effect on the metal monsters. The Martians landed and inspected the damage that they had done. Streets were beyond recognition, and mighty cities had been all but leveled. Bodies lay on the streets, unfortunate victims of the Martian destruction. By some means, the aliens had found a way to communicate with the giant insects that they had created. The bugs followed any instructions given to them from the spacemen. The Martians ordered the creatures to remove the bodies from the streets. Flying insects flew off with several bodies in their claws at a time. The aliens wanted all the streets clear before the people of Mars were brought to Earth to establish a new Martian domain. The engineer was ready to pull out of the train station when he looked out at the dark tunnel ahead. At first he couldn't believe his eyes, but after blinking and rubbing them he was sure. A giant insect was extending a huge claw towards the train. The bug touched the first car, tightening a grip around it. Amused by the little people running around inside, the bug lifted the car and shook it. Screaming men and women risked death on the third rail as they leaped out onto the tracks for safety. The entire station was thrown into a panic as they watched the fascinated insect crush several cars the way a child might crush a toy he had grown tired of. Soldiers were given powerful flamethrowers with which they were to fight off the giant insects. A patrol of soldiers were marching along the countryside when they came upon a colony of the bugs. The creatures noted the intruders immediately and moved menacingly towards them. The commanding officer gave the order to use the flamethrowers, and the men quickly responded. Searing streams of fire burst forth and lashed out at the oncoming insects. The creatures shrieked in pain as the flames struck on target. The hot fire consumed the bugs, but their deafening, inhuman screams continued to ring through the valley. At last, the soldiers could cope with the monsters. The Martians not only attacked the big cities, but also struck at the less populated sections of the country. Frightened citizens had to flee into the woods for safety or be burned with their homes. The invaders would leave the saucers and search small caves, looking for signs of hiding families. In one cave, a Martian found a group of 6 people huddled together in fear. Before the invader could use his death weapon, a dog leaped up at the alien. The startled spaceman ran out of the cave, followed by the animal and its young owner. The invader then turned his deadly ray on the barking dog, destroying it as the young boy cried out in horror. People had fled the cities in a mass exodus to escape the terror of the merciless Martians. They didn't know at the time that they would not be any safer in the country or in wooded areas. The giant insects sought the hills and farm areas for food. Crossing grassy areas, the creatures often unwittingly crushed fleeing humans under their huge legs. There wasn't an obstacle that could stop the monsters. Homes were smashed to bits if they lay in the path of the onrushing beasts. The inhabitants' only warning of peril was the crash of heavy footsteps as the creatures approached. Their only hope for survival was to hide before the insects detected them. Riding along a bumpy country road in their jeep, 3 soldiers looked up in time to see a huge flying insect heading in their direction. "Let's jump for that ditch!" cried the driver as he jammed on the brakes. The men leaped out of the vehicle as the bug crashed headlong into it. Seeing that the soldiers had escaped, the monster lashed out after them into the ditch. One of the men fell under the mighty blow. The other 2 soldiers fought side by side, trying to overpower their assaulter. The powerful creature continued his attack, not flying from the area till it had won the battle. Under the direction of their Martian commanders, a troop of giant insects united on a hilltop overlooking a U.S. Army camp. The weird cries of the bugs attracted the attention of the soldiers in the camp, and the men quickly prepared themselves for a battle. An immense line of creatures advanced towards the military establishment. Closer and closer the insects came, until the commanding officer gave the order to open fire. Rifle and machine gun fire crackled through the air, and bullets blazed a trail of death to the insects. The towering monsters fell in their tracks as the hard-fighting soldiers won the battle. With military units unable to combat every giant bug around, citizens were left defenseless and at the mercy of the destructive brutes. One giant bug marched across the Texas plains, destroying a fortune in livestock and ranch homes. Planes attacked the bug, but failed to stop it as the monster plodded forward. Just on the outskirts of one of Texas' largest cities was a hydroelectric dam which supplied most of the state's electric power. High-voltage electric wires surrounded the dam. The giant bug headed straight into the death-charged wires. Sparks were shot off in every direction as the bug became entangled in the lines. The electricity destroyed the monster. The streets of Paris were in an uproar. People screamed hysterically, running in every direction, trying to escape the monsters of destruction. Parisians watched in wide-eyed horror as giant insects, released from the flying saucers, twisted through the famous avenues. A huge caterpillar, more than 1,000 feet long, weaved itself around the base of the famed Eiffel Tower. Slowly it writhed its way up the steel structure, intent on reaching the top of the 987-foot site. The metal beams, which had withstood vicious hurricanes in the past, had never before been put to such a test of strength. The tower swayed to and fro until the strain snapped it in two. The President of the United States called a special emergency meeting with his top military generals and strategists. The group gathered in a wooded hut outside of demolished Washington, D.C. Midway through the discussion of the plans of the counter-invasion, an army lookout dashed into the hut. "We have to clear the area at once. Scouts report a giant spider approaching in our direction." The president and his advisors immediately boarded helicopters and watched the soldiers fight the spider from the air. Lives were lost as the brave men tried to destroy the insect. Without the proper weapons to combat the bug, the surviving soldiers were forced to flee. Helicopters cruised over wooded areas, always on the lookout for giant bugs. When one was spotted, word was flashed back to the military forts, giving the exact location of the insect. The fort immediately dispatched enough artillery and men to fight the menace. One monster was spotted a mile south of Fort Bragg in North Carolina. U.S. tanks surrounded the giant bug, blocking any possible escape path. A steady barrage of ammunition ripped into the insect, pushing it backwards into one of the tanks. Soldiers hurled hand grenades at the weakened creature, and they exploded the bug's heavy shell. The attack continued until the men were sure they'd destroyed the insect. Giant winged insects flew through the skies of Earth, often grabbing terrified people off the streets and flying away with them. Huge and powerful, the monsters could crash into fleeing automobiles and overturn them without any damage to themselves. The only means of combating the flying menaces was with helicopters. Crack shots were sent up with guns and ammunition, with orders to bring down the winged terrors. Battles in the sky were common over city streets as the insects dodged the bullets to survive, and at the same time tried to ram the helicopters. The brave men in the copters were in constant peril, but gallantly continued their fight. A jet bomber on a mission across the country saw a giant bug moving close to a populated village. The pilot flew as close to the ground as he could and released several bombs. Off target, the bombs didn't kill the bug, but badly wounded it. The insect bellowed loudly in pain, terrorizing the inhabitants in the nearby village. Soldiers quickly arrived on the scene and battled the crazed insect. Maddened by its wounds, the monster lashed out viciously at any moving object near it. Bazooka shells were fired at close range, inflicting further damage to the insect. With one last furious cry, the monster turned over on its back and died.